This is one of the two methods I use to sew my granny squares together. First, I'm going to make sure that they're facing each other, so the wrong side is facing out, and then I am going to match up the corners. I put 2 chains into my corners, so I'm going to start working into the one furthest away from me, and I'm going to pick up 1 loop, and then I'm going to pick up another loop from the other one on the opposite side. And then the method I'm using here is called the whip stitch. So for the second stitch, I'm going to pick up the next loop and match it up. And that's really it. Now, normally I would use a matching color, but I'm using a contrasting color for demonstration purposes. And while this doesn't exactly create an invisible seam, you will be able to see it, mostly because it's a contrasting color. It does create the flattest piece. There's no bumps at the seam. And it's also super easy to make sure that the stitches line up from granny square to granny square, because you just match up 1 double crochet with another double crochet and a chain with another chain, and there's not a lot of explanation going on there. Now this is what it'll look like when it's sewn together. You can tighten it a little bit, but it's not going to make that much of a difference. You can still see the stitches, but like I said, when you're using the same color, you can't tell. Part 2 will be in the comments on how to do the corners. This is how I like to sew my granny squares together using the whip stitch. Now this next section, I'm using a matching color instead of a contrasting color so that you can see how well the seam is hidden. And I'm using the exact same method as in the first video. I'm going to work into both chains of that quarter piece. For this kind of a granny square, I do like to make 2 chains in the corner, and this is just going to ensure that the corners are tight, or intersections, whatever you want to call it. And I'm just going to do the whip stitch all the way until the end, and then I'll open it up and show you what it looks like. Now I'm only working into one of the loops, the back loop to be exact, so the front loop is giving me this nice little border, and that helps me make sure that I'm keeping everything in line. The next part's going to go over how to do the horizontal row, and I hope to see you there. This is how I attach granny squares using the whip stitch, and for this part, I am going to work the horizontal line. I already worked on the vertical lines in the first 2 parts, and now we're gonna finish off our corners. Now the beginning of this I did the same way as I did in parts 1 and 2, but this is the last double crochet for the granny squares, and then I'm going to work into the first chain on the corner. Now those chain loops have already been worked into once, so they're going to already have yarn feeding through them. But this is going to ensure that there are no gaps in the center of where they're attached. It also helps with aligning them so that the border that you saw in the last part is still, making a cross or a very nice grid. Now that big yellow knot you see in the center there, that is where I attached the matching color to the contrasting color from parts 1 and 2. In hindsight, I probably would have done it the other way around and made the knot blue instead of yellow. If you run out of yarn for sewing, you can use the magic knot, and I have a video on that. You can use the magic knot to connect the pieces, or you can leave some tails and then just weave in those tail ends, and that'll keep them in place too. I prefer to use the magic knot just because it doesn't come undone and it doesn't unravel, and I don't have to weave in any ends. But in hindsight, I would have not made it yellow. This is what it looks like when it's sewn together. You have the border from only working into 1 loop, and it makes a nice little grid. And in the next method, I'm going to be using the invisible seam.